Are people with psychosis dangerous? It's an interesting question. There is a huge stigma against people with psychosis that we are violent, that we're homicidal, that we can't be controlled, and that we make up most of the violent acts that you see. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. Most people with psychosis or mental illness at large are not violent. They are no more violent than anyone else in the community. They are actually victimized by violent acts far more than they cause them. And most acts of violence are committed by people who are not mentally ill. Being a young male or a substance abuser is a much higher risk of committing a violent act than being mentally ill. In fact, most people with psychosis are more likely to harm themselves than others, although there is a small percentage of individuals who do commit violent acts. These acts of violence are typically caused by the person not having the correct treatment, having a previous history of violence, misusing or abusing drugs and alcohol, or being triggered by fear. What has been proven to reduce violence within this vulnerable community is access to effective treatment as soon as possible. There is no evidence that shows that people with mental illness or specifically psychosis are any more dangerous than anyone else. That being said, yes, there are people with psychosis who commit violent acts, just as there are people without psychosis who commit violent acts. It does not make up the majority of our community. It is not common. It is not a large number of us. It's possible, but does that mean we're all violent? No. I've been called dangerous just by my diagnosis alone. It's easy to throw that at someone when you personally know someone that is dangerous, but just because your loved one, your boyfriend, your sister was violent doesn't mean I am, doesn't mean my friends are, doesn't mean our whole community is. Violence happens regardless of your mental state. As I said before, people with psychosis are more likely to cause harm to themselves than to others. I am actually a lot less violent, a lot less prone to violence when I'm psychotic. I'm a lot more cautious and I actively go out of my way not to cause violence. So what I mean by that, like as an example, is when I was married, my ex-husband had a BB gun. It was like a BB gun pistol, and he would hide it around the apartment. It was something he did to mess with my head. He would like put it on a shelf for a couple days and then move it to the dresser in a drawer, and then he would move it to inside his boot. I specifically remember he put it inside his boot, and I thought that if I touched any object, I would bring it into existence, and it didn't exist until I touched it. So I refused to touch the BB gun, and he noticed this, and he kept hiding it all around the apartment, trying to make me touch it, before he finally fessed up that he'd been doing that, and he asked why I wouldn't touch it, and I said, if I touch it in this timeline, there's a timeline out there where I've killed someone, and I'm not gonna let that happen. So I actively went out of my way to avoid violence in that circumstance. I don't know why he did that, but I distinctly remember being so scared of touching the gun and the possibility that I would do something harmful that I recoiled like hell from touching that gun. So I'm not violent. My friends aren't violent. People I've met within the community aren't violent. I know it's out there. I know it's possible, but it is just as likely as someone without mental illness. So please don't lump our community in with violence as a whole. We're not just one big face of violence. We're individuals, and some of us happen to have violent tendencies. That doesn't mean we all do. Most of us are not like that. What sets off my psychosis? A number of things, actually. There's quite a few reasons that a person could go into psychosis, and some common triggers are having a genetic predisposition, like a family member who already has schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. You could go into psychosis from drug use, from childbirth, which would be postpartum psychosis. You can even go into psychosis from a crazy amount of stress. And for me, there have been a number of reasons why I've gone into psychosis. The first time I went into a psychotic episode, I think there were a few different reasons for why that happened. First of all, it was a really stressful time in my life. My family was going through a lot. I had lost 2 grandparents within about a year of each other. My parents were going through a divorce. I had an abusive boyfriend and we had a nasty breakup and he was stalking me. It was one of the most stressful times in my life. Aside from that, I was misdiagnosed as bipolar, so I probably wasn't on the right medications. And on top of that, I had just started smoking marijuana for the first time, and all of these things kind of culminated into a psychotic break. I did end up getting properly medicated after that episode, and I was relatively stable for a few years. I was still struggling with other mental health conditions, but my psychosis was in remission. I didn't have any active symptoms. And then in my early 20s, I started seeing a new doctor who was horrible, to say the least. He had a reputation for putting people on really bad combinations of medication. I wasn't the first of his patients to go through this, but basically he had me on a dangerous combination of meds. I was over-medicated. I was on meds that should not be prescribed together. And as a result of my medication regimen, I did go into my second psychotic break. So already I had had 2 separate episodes that were related to not being on the correct medication. And my third one was the episode where I decided to go off of my medication altogether. I got that thinking that a lot of people with mental illness do of, I'm better, I'm fine now, I don't need these medications, this is a hassle for me. I didn't want to go to doctors anymore. I wanted to be normal. I thought that if I just tried hard enough, I could keep myself from being mentally ill. And less than a month into being off of my medication, I had my third psychotic break. I also was smoking marijuana again. I had stints on and off of being sober, and that also contributed heavily, probably into how fast it happened. I had a couple more episodes following the third one, and these last 2 were a lot milder, and I didn't have a full psychotic break. I was psychotic, but I was able to have the presence of mind to go to the hospital and get properly medicated and come out of it. And these last 2 were caused by marijuana use because I struggled really hard to stay sober for a long time, and I could never stay sober more than a year for a really long time. And as a result of going into psychosis over and over again, and again, this was related to pretty much every one of my episodes, I was using marijuana. It was the determining factor in what got me sober today, and I'm now over 3 years sober as a result of having hit enough rock bottoms in psychosis to give up altogether. So there you have it. There are a number of factors that went into what set off my psychotic episodes. There has been some overlap with these factors. There have been multiple factors contributing to one episode at a time, and it's typically been because of marijuana use and not being properly medicated and just insane amounts of stress. So that's what's happened to me. I'd love to hear your experience. What has set off your episodes, and what has that been like for you? Let me know. Being medicated, do you feel lonely because you've lost the only reality you've ever known, even though that reality was super scary at times? Yeah, actually, in a sense, the reality I had before I ever went psychosis is done and over with. It's ended. It ended when I went psychotic for the first time, and I lost more of it every time I went psychotic. And at this point, I am such a completely different person, and my life has changed so drastically that whatever reality I had before, even though it's the same world that I'm in now, is over. So when I was psychotic, I saw the world through a lot of different eyes. Like, I had a lot of different identities, and I saw different perspectives of my life from a lot of different angles, from like outside of my body, from internally, through the eyes of like animals or aliens or dead people or boys and girls. Like, I had so many different perspectives that I never really felt like I was alone in my head, if that makes sense. Like, aside from the voices and people I saw, like, I was never alone in my head. There was always someone sharing my eyes with me. And when I was recovering from my worst episode, and it sunk in that I was alone in this perspective, there was no one sharing my head with me anymore, and that I would be alone with my own thoughts by myself for the rest of my life, I felt like a crippling loneliness. Like, it did feel like very isolating to be alone in my head and for it not to be filled with all this other chatter anymore. It still kind of is in the back of my head still, even though it's been years and I've like integrated back into having relationships with other people and conversations with people, which definitely does help. But there's always kind of this feeling of, now that I've seen life that way, I can't really unsee it. And so I'll always be like acutely aware of my singular linear perspective. And I think that's what makes it feel lonely more than anything else. This video is inspired by a conversation I had with a buddy of mine about the validity of psychosis and whether a diagnosis of schizophrenia would be warranted if a person had a psychotic episode with delusions and paranoia but no hallucinations. I did look into it, and in the DSM, to meet the criteria for a schizophrenia diagnosis, a person would have to meet 2 of 5 symptoms and be in an episode lasting 6 or more months. And the symptoms would be delusions, hallucinations, disorganized or incoherent speech, disorganized movements, and negative symptoms. So you could have schizophrenia without hallucinations. It's absolutely true. But it did get me thinking about my own episodes and how I used to think I didn't have hallucinations, and it made me feel like I was faking it and that my psychosis wasn't real because it wasn't as severe as someone who had hallucinations. Now, this is ridiculous because I know today that my symptoms were very severe. They were really, really, really fucking bad, to the point where I had a full-on break. Like, almost every single time I went into an episode, I was in a full-on break. And that doesn't just mean that you're aware of what you're hearing and seeing. It means that you have no concept of reality. So clearly anyone who loses their concept of reality is in a grave state. Nonetheless, I didn't believe that I'd had hallucinations for years. I genuinely didn't think I had hallucinations until I did some deep thinking on it and had to kind of recollect my thoughts and memories to discern what had happened. There's so much that happens in psychosis that I can't make sense of today even. And I had to sort of parse out what real meant to me to find out if I'd even had hallucinations. And I just didn't realize it. You'd think it would be something that a person would realize. You'd think that looking back, a person could say, oh my God, that totally wasn't real, but I couldn't tell. And that's in part because they were either so realistic that I still can't really tell, or I came out of an episode and realized they were so unrealistic that there's no way I actually saw that, and it must have been my imagination because that couldn't have possibly happened. And technically, none of it did happen. They weren't real. So to look back from like a sane mind and see a hallucination through those eyes, of course I would think it was my imagination. I had to unexplain to myself what reality meant so that I could make sense of like my nun hallucination, which I've talked about before. The nun would walk with me when I'd be wandering. I used to wander for miles and miles and miles, and she would walk with me, watching me, just kind of looking over me, which I assumed was like her way of keeping me safe, a weird looking guardian angel, if you will. And when I came out of the episode, I thought, no, I was walking alone. Like there was no one with me. That was just like my imagination. Similarly, it took me years to realize that conversations I'd had didn't actually happen with people that weren't actually real. I just was so immersed in the experience of that reality that even if they looked freakish to me, they were so hyper realistic that it was normal. Like, that was absolutely acceptable. Noises I heard, like, clatter, car engines in the room with me, they made sense. They just made sense in that state, so I didn't even question it. Also, some of my hallucinations just didn't seem like even real as hallucinations. Like, I would tend to see things that were projected onto reality. Like, I would see scenery of like a washing machine, but it was sitting on the couch. And I could kind of tell that there was a couch underneath it, even though I could still see a washing machine there. So I'd think, well, if I can still see the couch through this washing machine, it's in my imagination because it doesn't even look real in this state. And even in that state, I'd think to myself, no, that's not right. Like, that can't be right. So there was a part of me that sensed that even that was so ridiculous that it couldn't possibly be coming from me. It wasn't until after my third episode, when I actually started speaking openly about psychosis, which I had never done before, that I realized I did in fact have hallucinations, and I'd had hallucinations in every single episode. I could explain to myself, like, logically, that these things weren't true, but it wasn't until it was confirmed by other people around me who'd also had that experience that I could, like, unmask my own perceptions of what had happened and really digest, like, what my reality really was back then. It was just so indiscernible that there was no making sense of it. There's still no making sense of it. I think there will be things I question for the rest of my life. And I just have to be okay with that, because at the end of the day, it's a really nonsensical disorder. Like, literally the definition of nonsensical. It's batty, it's wild. I will never, ever, ever come close to describing. I try my best to translate what happened, but there's really no saying just exactly how wild that experience is. I was ashamed of my schizoaffective disorder for years and years of keeping it secret to myself and not wanting to tell anyone, scared of the stigma that came with it, embarrassed by the things I had done, and humiliated by the things that had been done to me, things that were outside of my control. Honestly, most of it was outside of my control. And I couldn't accept that I had this disorder. I rejected the diagnosis because I couldn't really live with the severity. I didn't know how to live with the severity, and I was so scared of it ever happening again. Some of the things I had done were honestly not that embarrassing, but I was embarrassed to be seen in that state. I don't know what I look like when I'm psychotic, and there's something about not knowing what other people see in me that leaves me feeling like I have a blind spot that I'm unaware of. And I don't want to know what I looked like in that state, because the memories are enough to know that I was pretty scary, and I've been told by multiple people that I was scary. I've seen pictures of like how dead I looked in the eyes, or like looking like I was high. And it's not me. I look at that person and that wasn't me. And it's so scary that my mind and my body was taken over by this illness that dictated my entire life without me knowing what was happening. I feel like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There's also a certain gravity to coming out of episodes and being in this really heavy, dark place, and remembering through clear eyes for the first time what actually happened, and sifting through like what wasn't real to find out what was real, and realizing, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe that happened to me. I can't believe someone would do that to me. Like, all of the traumatizing things that you never ever would have done that you did, and remembering that it hurts, and it's something that like I just wanted to walk away and never address ever with anyone. 10 years, I think, after my first episode, like after my third episode, after well over 2 year span of psychosis cumulatively, I actually did talk to someone for the first time. It was someone I knew from a meeting, and she shared openly about it. She shared about psych wards and like streaking in the streets, and she wasn't ashamed in the least. And I thought, oh my God, I did that. I was streaking through the streets, and I'm very ashamed of that. Like, I really need to talk to her. Talking to her took down this barrier, this huge barrier that I'd had in me that was keeping me isolated and feeling like I was the only person who had done these things. And it comforted me. It allowed me to continue talking about psychosis with other people who'd also had it, and then be able to talk about it with people who hadn't had it, and then be public about it, because it's normal. It's perfectly normal to have mental illness, and there's really nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with me or anyone else who has psychosis. We're just mentally ill. I honestly still deal with a great deal of shame. I can't lie. I still struggle with that. I think there are some things I'll never be able to talk about that happened to me, but talking with people and connecting and being open and vulnerable about it has actually helped me break down my shame a lot. So I've gotten over some hurdles that way. It is a work in progress, and I think it will always be a work in progress. But ultimately, my aim with these videos is to normalize psychosis, because I think it's a perfectly normal disease, and people would feel maybe a little bit better if it didn't carry such a heavy, fearful stigma, and we could all just accept that it's normal. It's as normal as any other mental illness, and really there's nothing to be ashamed about with that condition.